the forgotten daughter of a king. A biblical story of silence, loss, and unseen faith. Some stories in the Bible thunder like storms. They speak of giants falling, seas splitting, and kings rising to glory. But other stories arrive like a whisper. They do not shout for attention. They are not carved into monuments or celebrated in songs. Yet if you listen closely, they echo with a depth of sorrow and faith that can shake the human heart more than any battlefield victory. This is one of those stories. It is a story of a woman whose name appears only briefly in Scripture, and yet whose life carries the weight of broken promises, silent endurance, and a faith refined through unbearable loss. Her name was Merab, the forgotten ones of Scripture. When we read the Bible, our eyes are often drawn to familiar figures. David, the warrior king. Saul, the tragic ruler. Jonathan, the loyal friend. But Scripture is also filled with people who stand in the background, men and women whose lives were shaped by decisions they never made, whose suffering was real, yet rarely explained. Merab, the firstborn daughter of King Saul, was one of them. She was not remembered for miracles. She was not praised for prophetic words. She did not lead an army or write a psalm. And yet, her life tells a story that countless people today know all too well. The story of being promised something, watching it taken away, and being forced to live with the consequences in silence. Born into power, raised without choice. Merab was born into royalty. From the moment she could walk the halls of the palace, her life belonged not to herself, but to the crown. In ancient Israel, daughters of kings were not free to dream of their own futures. They were political instruments, bargaining pieces and alliances, symbols of loyalty, tools of strategy. Merab grew up surrounded by wealth and servants, but she also grew up learning a hard truth. Her life would be decided by her father's fears. King Saul, once chosen by God, was slowly unraveling. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from him, and a shadow crept into his mind, a shadow of jealousy, insecurity, and dread. And Merab, though innocent, would one day be pulled into that darkness. The arrival of a shepherd boy. Then came David, a shepherd from Bethlehem, young, unassuming, carrying nothing but harp and a quiet confidence in God. When David first entered Saul's court, it was not as a warrior, but as a healer. His music calmed the king's troubled spirit. For the first time in years, peace returned to Saul's eyes. Merab watched from a distance. She saw something different in David, not ambition, not hunger for power, but a reverence for God that felt rare and genuine. Then came the moment that changed everything. Goliath fell. The giant who terrified Israel was defeated by a boy with a sling and unshakable faith. David became a hero overnight. The people sang his name in the streets. And in that moment of public triumph, King Saul made a promise spoken, a hope born. Saul declared that the man who defeated Goliath would receive great honor, and more than that, he would receive the king's daughter in marriage. That daughter was Merab. For the first time in her life, something stirred within her. Not romantic fantasy, but hope. Hope that her marriage would mean something more than politics. Hope that she might be joined to a man who truly feared the Lord. Scripture does not tell us what Merab felt in that moment, but we can imagine the quiet anticipation of a woman whose future suddenly seemed touched by purpose. Yet what was spoken in public would not be honored in private. A father's fear changes everything. As David's popularity grew, Saul's heart hardened. The songs that praised David became knives to the king's pride. Saul has slain his thousands, they sang, and David his tens of thousands. Fear took root. Saul no longer saw David as a hero. He saw him as a threat. And so the promise made to Merab became dangerous. To give her to David would be to strengthen him. To honor the vow would be to empower the very man Saul feared would take his throne. So the king did what fearful leaders often do. He broke his word, given away without a voice. When the time came for Merab to be given in marriage, she was not led to David. Instead, she was given to another man, Adriel. No explanation, no recorded protest, no space for grief. Merab's future was redirected in a single decision, and Scripture moves on as if nothing happened. But for Merab, everything changed. She was not merely denied a marriage. She was denied dignity, trust, and a belief that promises meant anything at all. And as if that wound were not deep enough, another followed, watching her promise given to another. Soon after, Saul gave his younger daughter Michal to David. The man Merab had been promised now belonged to her sister. Imagine the silence of that moment. Imagine standing at a distance, watching a life that could have been yours unfold in someone else's hands. Scripture tells us Michal loved David. It tells us of their marriage, their struggles, their story. Of Merab, it tells us almost nothing. And yet, her silence speaks volumes. A new life built from what remained. Merab did what many are forced to do when life betrays them. She survived. She became a wife to Adriel. She became a mother. 5 sons were born to her. 5 lives that gave her reason to endure. In them, she found meaning again. In them, she poured the love that had nowhere else to go. But the shadow of Saul's house still loomed, because in Scripture, unresolved sin never disappears. It waits. The cost of father sin. After Saul's death, David became king. Then came a famine, 3 long years without relief. When David sought the Lord, the answer was devastating. The famine was not natural. It was a result of blood guilt. Saul had violated a covenant with the Gibeonites. Justice demanded reparation. 7 descendants of Saul would die to atone for the crime. And among them were 5 sons of Merab, 5 innocent lives, taken not for their own actions, but for the sins of their grandfather. A mother left with silence. Scripture does not record Merab's scream. It does not record her tears. But it tells us this. She, along with another grieving mother, guarded the bodies of their sons, driving away birds by day and beasts by night. She refused to abandon them, even in death. And in that silent vigil, something holy happened. The king was moved. The dead were honored. The famine ended. But Merab returned home with empty arms. Why her story matters. Merab never reclaimed what was taken from her. She never received public justice. But her story reminds us of something essential. Faith is not proven by victory alone. Sometimes it is proven by endurance, by choosing not to curse God when nothing makes sense, by continuing to live when every reason of hope has been stripped away. And this is where her story truly begins. Because to understand Merab's life is to understand the cost of silence, the weight of broken promises, and the quiet strength of faith that survives without recognition. In the next part of this story, we will walk deeper into her suffering and discover what her hidden life teaches us about God's presence in our darkest losses. The weight of broken promises. Merab's life between what was spoken and what was taken. When the Bible moves on, people assume the pain has ended. But silence in Scripture does not mean silence in life. After Merab was given to Adriel, history records almost nothing about her. No speeches, no recorded prayers, no dramatic turning point. And yet, this is where the true weight of her story begins, not in what is written, but in what must have been endured, living with a promise that never died. Merab did not forget the promise that had once been spoken over her life. Even if she tried, the memory would return in quiet moments. When the palace lights dimmed, when laughter echoed from rooms she no longer entered, when David's name was mentioned in passing. She had not asked to be chosen. She had not asked to be promised. And yet, once the promise was spoken, it became part of her identity. Broken promises do not disappear. They linger, reshaping how a person trusts, hopes, and loves. Merab learned to live with that tension between what God allowed to be spoken and what God allowed to be taken away. A marriage without a story. Adriel, the man she was given to, is barely described in Scripture. This silence itself is telling. Her marriage was not celebrated. It was not framed as redemption. It was simply a sign. For many, this is a familiar pain. Not every life unfolds with clarity or explanation. Some paths are chosen for us by authority, culture, or fear, and we are left to walk them faithfully without understanding why. Merab did what she could. She became a wife. She built a home from fragments. She found stability where she was placed. And slowly, a new purpose emerged. Motherhood as survival. Merab bore 5 sons. 5 lives that anchored her to future. 5 hearts that gave her a reason to keep moving forward. Motherhood did not erase her grief, but it gave her direction. Each child carried the legacy of Saul's house, and with it, the unspoken burden of being born into a fractured lineage. Merab raised them in a world shaped by royal failure, a kingdom still recovering from its own spiritual collapse. Yet Scripture gives no hint that she raised them with bitterness. There is no suggestion of rebellion, resentment, or revenge, only quiet endurance, watching history rewrite itself. As David's life unfolded, Merab watched from the margins. She saw him flee Saul's rage. She saw her sister Michal struggle in a marriage born of politics and danger. She saw the kingdom shift hands, slowly but inevitably. David rose. Saul fell. And with Saul's fall came the unraveling of his house. When David became king, he sought to rule with justice and devotion to God. But justice in Scripture is never shallow. It reaches backward, uncovering debts that cannot be ignored. And Saul had left behind one final debt. A famine that spoke louder than words. 3 years. That is how long the land suffered. No rain, no relief, no explanation, until David sought the Lord. The answer was devastating in its clarity. The famine was not a coincidence. It was a consequence. Saul had violated a sacred covenant with the Gibeonites, shedding innocent blood, and blood guilt demanded atonement. This is where Merab's story returns to the center of Scripture, not through her own actions, but through the lives of her children, the cost paid by the innocent. The Gibeonites demanded justice, not revenge. They did not ask for gold. They did not ask for land. They asked for 7 descendants of Saul, 7 lives to bear the weight of one man's sin. Among those chosen were Merab's 5 sons. There is no record of protest, no argument, no appeal. The text moves forward with brutal efficiency. But imagine the moment Merab realized what was being asked. 5 sons, 5 futures, 5 hearts she had carried, raised, protected, all to be taken for a crime they did not commit, standing in the ruins of faith. This is the point where many stories break, where faith collapses under the weight of injustice, where God feels distant, even cruel. And yet, Scripture does not record Merab cursing God. It records her staying. She stayed near the bodies of her sons. She stayed through scorching days and freezing nights. She stayed when birds descended and beasts approached. Her grief did not turn her away from devotion. It deepened it. She would not allow her sons to be dishonored, even in death. The power of silent faithfulness. Merab did not preach. She did not confront the king. She did not demand explanation. She kept watch. And somehow, her silence spoke louder than words. It moved David's heart. It stirred remembrance. It restored dignity to the dead. Only after their proper burial did rain fall again. The famine ended. But Merab's personal famine did not. What Scripture doesn't say, but teaches. The Bible does not tell us how Merab lived afterward, but it tells us enough. She lived long enough to be remembered, not for power, not for triumph, but for faithfulness under unbearable weight. Her story reminds us that some of God's most profound servants are not those who stand in victory, but those who remain standing after everything has been taken. And as her life fades back into silence, one truth remains. God saw her, even when history barely noticed. And that truth prepares us for what her life ultimately teaches, about endurance, justice, and the hope that waits beyond suffering. Seen by God, remembered by heaven, the quiet legacy of Merab. When the rain finally fell and the famine ended, Scripture moves on. The land healed. The kingdom stabilized. Life continued. But for Merab, the storm did not simply pass. Some losses do not fade when circumstances improve. Some griefs do not end when justice is served. They become part of who we are. And yet, this is precisely where Merab's story offers its deepest lesson. After the silence, a life still lived. The Bible does not tell us where Merab went after burial of her sons. It does not tell us how long she lived, or how she spent her final years. But absence of detail does not mean absence of meaning. We can imagine her returning to a quieter life. No longer a princess, no longer a mother, no longer part of the court's attention. a woman shaped by grief, yet not destroyed by it. She lived on the margins of history, but not on the margins of God's awareness, the strength to keep living. Merab's faith was not dramatic. She did not proclaim visions. She did not receive promises of restoration. She was not rewarded with new sons, new honor, or public vindication. Her faith was something far more difficult. It was a faith to wake up each morning and continue breathing when life had given her no reason to hope for change. This kind of faith rarely makes headlines, yet it is the kind God sees most clearly, a different measure of faithfulness. We often measure faith by outcomes, by answered prayers, by healed bodies, by restored relationships. But Merab's life challenges that measure. What if faithfulness is not about what we receive, but about who we remain when nothing is returned? Merab remained present. She remained compassionate. She remained faithful to the dead, and therefore faithful to God. She did not understand the justice of it all, and Scripture never claimed she did. She simply refused to abandon her integrity. The God who sees the unnoticed. Merab's name appears briefly in the biblical record, but her actions changed the course of events. Her silent vigil moved a king's heart. Her endurance brought dignity to the dishonored. Her faithfulness preceded restoration for an entire nation. This is how God often works. Not through spectacle, but through persistence. Not through those who shout, but through those who stay. For those who feel forgotten. Merab's story speaks directly to those who feel overlooked by God. To those whose prayers were not answered the way they hoped. To those who watched others receive the blessings they were promised. To those who paid a price for sins they did not commit. Her life assures us of one unshakable truth. Being unseen by history does not mean being unseen by God. The Bible does not forget Merab because she was unimportant. It remembers her precisely because she endured. Faith without explanation. Merab never received an explanation for her suffering, and that may be the hardest part of her story. God did not appear to her with reasons. No prophet recorded her comfort. No miracle erased her loss. Instead, God allowed her to live in mystery. And in that mystery, she chose faith anyway. This is not a weak faith. It is the strongest kind. A legacy written in heaven. Merab left no throne behind, no descendants to carry her name forward. But she left something greater. She left a testimony. A testimony that righteousness does not always look like victory. That obedience does not always end in reward. That faith does not always rescue us from loss. Sometimes, faith simply walks with us through it. Why her story still matters today. In a world that celebrates visibility, success, and recognition, Merab's life offers a quiet resistance. She reminds us that God's kingdom is not built on applause, but on endurance, that heaven records acts of faith the world never notices. That silence does not mean abandonment. The final lesson of Merab's story does not end with resolution. It ends with presence, with a woman who stayed when it would have been easier to walk away, with a faith that did not demand answers, but trusted God's character when answers never came. And in that trust, her story continues to speak. An invitation to the listener. Perhaps you see yourself in Merab. Perhaps you have lived with broken promises. Perhaps you have suffered losses that never made sense. Perhaps you have felt invisible in your faith. If so, know this: God sees you, not when you triumph, but when you endure, not when you are celebrated, but when you remain faithful in silence. And like Merab, your story, though unseen by many, is known in heaven,